You're listening to Mentoring Developers. How to do HTTP services using REST, tools, technologies, and I heard that you wrote a book about that.
Yes, well, I was involved, I helped out, I was on the advisory board with Microsoft's Web API project. So Web API is their framework for building on ASP.NET HTTP Web APIs. The parts that I contributed towards the book were fairly technology agnostic. I was talking about media type design, and I have a chapter on working with HTTP client, which is the .NET client for making HTTP requests. But there's a lot of good information in there. There are a number of other good books. One that I really like, and somebody needs to do an updated version of this, is the Restful Web Services Cookbook. And it literally... Are you familiar with the Gang of Four Patterns book?
Oh, yeah.
Right, so this is kind of like the Gang of Four Patterns book, but for HTTP. It says, well, if you want to do this in a web API, then this is the pattern that you can use. This is the interaction model. And so, somebody really needs to create another book like that just goes through a whole bunch more scenarios of 8 patterns in HTTP. Anyway, the Cookbook is a good book.
It has 4.5 stars, 26 reviews on Amazon.
Yeah. The updated Restful Web Services book now it's by Mike Amundsen and Leonard Richardson, is another great book. It's a sequel to the original Restful Web Services by Sam Ruby and Leonard Richardson. And that's another great book to get. But this is probably really terrible advice, but you know what? Reading the RFC 7230, 7231, the HTTP specs, it takes a little while to get used to reading that material because of the way the material's organized, because of the terminology that's used. But if you're going to build applications on the web, on the internet, learning how to read IETF specifications is worth its weight in gold. I find so much material in those specifications that has been really well thought out, and the justification and the reasoning are usually in those specs, and they're not the most interesting reading, and they, as I say, they do take a bit of time to get used to, but it's one of those skills, if you can learn to read those comfortably, that will serve you tremendously.
So these RFCs are these documents that IETF produces that are...
Well, hold on. Technically, no. See,
okay.
the IETF is a really interesting standards body in that there is really no membership. Anybody can contribute towards the IETF. You can go to anywhere where you can create a web page, and you can create a spec, and you can go and join any of the mailing lists in the different working groups. As I say, there's no membership at all, and you can say, look, I've created this spec, and what do you think of it? And they will give you feedback on it. Now, there are recommended formats for how to actually do these specs, and they start out with what's called an internet draft, right? So you create this document that you say it's an internet draft, and the reason for these templates is there's just certain ways that they do things, and if you follow the template, then you'll conform to all of the standard boilerplate type stuff. But then once you present that to the working group, you'll get a bunch of people who've been doing this for a very long time who'll read your spec and go, nah, you shouldn't say that. Oh, you're missing this. Oh, you need to say that. And you'll get technical feedback from some really, really smart people. And at that point, if it serves a real valuable purpose, then it can actually move into a more formal standards track. If it's just accepted as, yes, we understand the value of this, then the idea behind the IETF is you need 2 working implementations of a particular spec before it can move on to the next stage. But even if you don't take your specification that far, just the process of formally documenting a particular idea. Let's say you're building something, you decide, I need to send some metadata along with this. Maybe I could put it in an HTTP header. And you can write a spec that just says, okay, I think we need an HTTP. Here's a good example. Nobody's actually gone and written a correlation ID. What can sometimes happen is you make a bunch of requests, and the requests are related to each other. And maybe we should have a standardized header name that we put some kind of GUID in it, and all of the requests that are related to each other should all have that GUID in the header. And I'm waiting for somebody to come along and actually write the spec that says we should call it this, and this is what it should contain, and this is what its purpose is, and people are going to go, yeah, we love it, okay, that's cool, let's all do that. And it requires no money other than your time, and it requires no official sign up or anything. You just get involved. And that's one of the reasons I love the IETF so much more than a lot of the other standards bodies that are, a lot of the stuff happens in closed meetings, a lot of the stuff requires fairly hefty membership fees in order to participate, whereas the IETF doesn't. That's my little sales pitch on the IETF. I've started at conferences, if they do lightning talks, I'll do a 5-minute talk on why we should care about the IETF. So you got that here.
You really got me excited about it. I opened the page and I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. Because the idea of reading an RFC just scares me.
Oh, yeah. And, it did for, and, the first one that I really, really went into in any depth was RFC 6570, which is URI templates. So URI templates is a specification that allows you to put parameters inside, create a little template for building a URI and parameterizing it. And there's some weird rules in there, and you can put strange characters, and it was like, okay, I kind of understand part of it. And I was like, I want to write a library that does this, right? So I'd read it, and I'm like, okay, I started. And then I got to one of the appendices, and it's like, oh, by the way, here's an algorithm of how you implement it. I'm like, whoa, okay, cool. Okay, so I just followed the algorithm along, and I converted it into C# and step by step, and it's a single pass where it just walks through the characters in this URI template and does a substitution of the parameter tokens with the parameter value. And then the end result is you have a valid URI with the parameters passed in. And I learned so much in that process, just in trying to figure out how to write this little library and going back to the spec and going, okay, well, what are they saying here? And all of the IETF specs use a special syntax for describing structures called ABNF, which is Augmented Backhouse NOR format, which is another format that it's weird at first, but once you've dug into a few different specs and you've read about it, it's a little weird syntax, but you get used to it. It's not that painful eventually. But they have a very fairly rigorous mentality about only saying anything once. They're very dry. So instead of saying something again, they'll point to another spec. So when you're trying to read one spec, you'll probably end up with like 5 browser pages open, where you're trying to read all these different specs and conglomerate all that information, which is a pain in the butt until you start to get used to some of the base ones. And then at that point, it's like, oh, well, yeah, I've read that thing before. I know that. And so then all of a sudden, over time, it just gets easier and easier to read them because you're familiar with the specs that they're referring to and go, oh, yeah, I know what that spec's all about. So it's as I say, it has been one of the most valuable things that I've done in the last 10 years. Insofar as getting used to being able to read those, and the amount of useful information I've found in there is tremendous.
I think that just also goes to show your dedication. I mean, you have to have some passion for a thing. It's good because you were mentioning that people shouldn't restrict themselves to a particular type of technology. They should broaden their horizons, and I think that's really good, really important. But at some point, you have to focus on something if you want to go at any depth, and you certainly have, right? It's not. Yeah. This is not bedtime reading.
No, it's not. And I realized one of the reasons why I really was attracted to that is, as a developer, I've worked for a number of companies and worked for myself for a long time. So I always tended to end up being the most senior developer on the team. So I never really had somebody to go and ask questions to. So I ended up trying to figure stuff out always on my own. And that's why I've made a lot of mistakes and learned the hard way many, many, many times. So when I was presented with this, here's a bunch of really smart people that made all of their work available for free, and all you have to do is read it, and then you can just use it in your own applications, and it all fits together and it all works together in a nice way to build distributed systems that are scalable on the web and can last for years. It's like you've just answered my prayers there, because now I don't have to be uncertain about things anywhere near as much as I used to, because I didn't know how to do it before.
Yeah, this is incredible. I think being a software developer is so many things, and it requires focus, it requires dedication, it requires passion, but it requires an open mind, and you can get knowledge from different areas. You can go into hardware development, and that's a whole another field and a whole another set of learning.
For show notes and transcripts, visit us at mentoringdevelopers.com.